Well, good evening, everybody. What a lovely, lovely summer's evening this is. And it's a pleasure to have all of you here on campus this evening. As you know, we take our appointments to chairs very, very seriously here at Hope. And when we do have professors appointed at the appropriate time, we invite them to address us. And this evening we gather to honor the inaugural chair in theatre studies and drama, Professor Simon Piasecki. Now, if you wondered why we didn't walk in, we're standing outside the door, it's simply because we waited for Professor Piasecki's family to arrive, and it's a great delight to welcome them because, as we all know, these achievements are really more than the achievement of one person and all the people who support them. We have the wife of our professor here, and the two of the children here, including relatives, and we have Professor Piasecki's mother, who is shortly to come if she's not here already. So, indeed, wonderful, wonderful. Just made it. We held on as long as we could. Nice to have you as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, we gather then to celebrate the inaugural chair in the discipline, and as is our custom, the Pro-Vice Chancellor. I should also say, the Pro-Chancellor, our Pro-Chancellor is here, Monsignor John Devine. Yes, welcome. And I gather a senior colleague, Pro-Chancellor or Pro-Vice Chancellor from Chester's here as well. You're very welcome. A sister university of our university as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me invite Professor Newport to introduce our speaker.
Colleagues and distinguished guests, friends and family of Professor Piasecki, welcome to this final inaugural lecture for the 2014-2015 academic year. Professor Piasecki's roots can be traced back to a recession-hit Midlands community, and he was the first of his family to attend university, graduating in 1989 from what is now Nottingham Trent University with a degree in the creative arts. His studies there concentrated in painting and photography, although he also included studies of performance and dance. Following graduation, Professor Piasecki spent 10 fruitful and very formative years co-building performing arts departments into further education colleges, and he has retained a huge regard for the further education sector, which he notes is all too often less than fully recognized for the outstanding work that it does in turning around the prospects of young people, particularly those from disadvantaged contexts. Professor Piasecki's early work as an artist was built upon an interest in, well, pretty much everything, actually, when I looked at the CV. For example, he has performed with the London City Ballet. He has produced album artwork for a number of cult rock bands, including Wolfsbane and Def Jam. He has also painted exhibits for the National Trust for Scotland and undertaken a master's degree in visual communication. The most formatively powerful experience, however, Professor Piasecki tells me, was the decade that he spent within the North Midlands Artists Collective known as Bet4, that is, between four cities. And it was during this period that he exhibited internationally, and also the time when his practice turned in particular to performance art. His creative works were shown at platforms and large festivals in Cassel, Paris, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and the National Review of Live Art in Glasgow. He became known particularly for his fusion of experimental electronic music, vocal work, and physical energy. And I was thinking about that. What does the fusion of experimental electronic music, vocal work, and physical energy look like? Well, it sounds pretty exciting to me, I have to say. At the end of the 90s, Professor Piasecki was chosen by Pina Bausch to perform with Tanztheater Wuppertal in her recreated production of Victor at Sadler's Wells. In 2000, Professor Piasecki was invited as an artist, together with his partner, at the International Festival of Experimental Art in St. Petersburg, one of the first shows of its kind at the end of the period of the Soviet Union. And it was this experience in this location and the work that came from it that led directly to a rediscovery of his relatives in Ukraine, lost since his grandfather's death in 1944. And this formed the basis of the next 15 years of research practice into identity. And this included his PhD, which is entitled Lost Luggage, Cartographies of Self and Other in Performance. And his PhD was received that particular distinction of being awarded without any corrections. Professor Piasecki's academic career has been characterized by innovation in curriculum design for theatre, dance and performance. And he's taught abroad, also here in the UK at the universities of Derby and at Chester, at Leeds Metropolitan University, and then immediately prior to coming to Hope at the University of Salford. Professor Piasecki has published broadly and internationally with numerous book chapters and articles and conference papers to his name. Publications are very important, of course, but in the particular area in which Professor Piasecki works, so are performances and the creation of artifacts. And it is here that Professor Piasecki has excelled. Professor Piasecki is well known for the major and significant impact that he's had in research practice, performing works nationally and internationally in multiple forms, including gallery films, photography, painting, illustration, installation and site-specific performance, participatory works, poetry, scriptwriting, dance and devised theatre. Interest in his work is such that Leeds University Fine Art Department has exhibited a collection of his notebooks. Professor Simon Piasecki is married to Dr. Shelley Piasecki, a senior academic at Chester University, and has 4 children, Frazier, Callum, Felix and Greta. He's been a practicing Mahayana Buddhist for 20 years, practice that's included living for 1 year in a monastic order. Indeed, it was during that time that he spent in a Himalayan village of Alki that he fell ill and was cared for by a poverty-stricken family. And it was that act of immediate kindness, human kindness, that has in part inspired the lecture tonight. And so it is a great pleasure now to invite Professor Simon Piasecki to deliver that lecture, which is entitled The Wealth of Moral Sentiments, Altruism, Peril and Performance. Professor Piasecki.
Can you hear me? All right. Right, I should get over some initial nerves and crack on. Well, I didn't recognise myself there. That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Newport. I'm quite in awe of myself. No, it was fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm not really. Kindly regard this talk as a cartography then across the disciplines, formed out of the theme of altruism, travel and performance. That is our adventure, and I hope that it will represent a sense of duty to the contexts of my department. I've put sort of images up at the back. Obviously, you can't see them too brilliantly, but there's something anyway. Drama, dance and performance studies finds itself at an exciting moment here at Liverpool Hope University, reaching its 40th academic year in one form or another. And the current team inherits an important place within the world movement of performance studies. Members of the team represent a philosophical investment in notions of performance that, whilst beginning and ending in the theatre space, extend out in conversation with culture, language and geography. We make performance. We write and publish around dance, identity, walking, popular theatre, activism, cultural geography, ritual, theology, social justice and the performance of everyday life. We are proud hosts of our new Hope playwriting competition, which has just seen its first prize winners, which we're very thrilled with as well. And thankful for the university's investment in that and our vibrant Cornerstone Festival, which happens in November. I've been privileged to take up the chair in this department, and I hope that my investment across the disciplines serves it fully. To begin then, an observation from spending 15 years studying belonging is that humankind, in spite of the horrors of human conflict and fundamental terrorism, has an essentially altruistic moral imperative. There are moments of such immediacy and impact when thought is replaced by instinct, when we might glimpse human participation in the absence of rank, role, or political attitude. In Antonin Artaud's strange likening of theatre to the plague, he suggests that the performance space is the only other possibility for seeing humanity as it truly is, devoid of construct and censorship. Whether that's true or not, in a time of plague, or let us say disaster, human beings do not simply sink to cruelties and self-interest, but rather put themselves at risk in the most extraordinary ways in order to help one another. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in 2012, Maya Salovitz wrote for Time that, quote, "Although there's a mentality that disasters provoke frenzied selfishness and brutal survival of the fittest competition, the reality is that people coping with crises are actually quite altruistic, and ceaseless reports of acts of kindness abound everywhere." Close quote. We're hearing this now with the tragic suffering of the earthquake in Nepal. Eric Johnson discusses this in respect of tribal behaviour, and in doing so, raised my attention to its antithesis, really, in Ayn Rand's 1957 novel, Atlas Shrugged, from which we find a framework for the philosophy of objectivism. And I'm going to come to that shortly. I want first to introduce an unlikely antagonist to Rand, the 18th century economist Adam Smith. And I remembered Adam Smith actually from my rather failed economic classes at school, and particularly with the example of the pin maker, which you'll find on the back of the £20 note, I believe, as well. Smith is unlikely as an antagonist to Rand, only in as much as he's famed for his 1776 magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, which argued for a free market economy with little government interference, seemingly in absolute tune with the concerns of Ayn Rand. But prior to The Wealth of Nations, in 1759, he published a far less well-known book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which, whilst not contradictory, refers to a human capacity for what he calls loveliness, a right-mindedness, and carries a most memorable opening sentence. "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." Conversely, Rand's Atlas Shrugged presents this interest in the fortunes of others as devastating the economy and destroying jobs. The struggle of two characters unfolds, both dedicated to the honesty of industry and profit, but consistently undermined by the dishonest behaviour of politicians who claim to be interested in social morality and equality of opportunity. See how timely my talk is. Hank Rearden is a still producer, a handsome and serious businessman to whom hard work and honest profit is everything, whilst Dagny Taggart, an equally handsome woman, is his equal as Director of Operations for Taggart Transcontinental Railways. Rand uses the ceaseless determination of these two characters in the face of endless legislative undermining, declaratively, to illustrate the damage of social imperatives to hard work and natural market forces. In Atlas Shrugged, legislation is wielded to disempower industrialists personally and in Randt's language, to loot capital. But there's no real intention to moral goodness, and in this regard, Randt's argument cannot dissuade me from Smith's, because her antagonists have no virtue. The legislators, looters, bear no responsibility for the mystery of a resulting failure of the economy. Trains are reduced to 6 wagons to appease rail unions. Oil fields cannot distribute effectively. Gasoline stations fail. Car manufacturers close. Communities collapse. Randt takes the two industrialists then on a tour that reveals to them the devastation of this undermining behavior with its center in Washington. They arrive in Wisconsin at the site of a previously leading automobile factory that is derelicted and looted of its machinery. But the haunting context is the devastation of local people without work, of families living in squalor, reduced to apocalyptic visions without running water or power. As they drive from the remnants of this town, a similar landscape to The Walking Dead, which I'll come to, and books such as Cormac McCarthy's The Road, oh, if only I had time, they pass a peeling and weathered billboard advertising a washing machine. This image reminds me also of Pinter's The Caretaker. And indeed, the theme of Harold Pinter's play is not without relevance to Atlas Shrugged, because even if Pinter's thesis is not objectivist in nature, there's still a distrust of legislated welfare. In The Caretaker, Pinter's protagonist is Davies, a veteran and a tramp, who is brought home by one of 2 brothers, Aston, who has saved him from a fight whilst he was working for a night in a cafe. Davis complains rather typically, 10 minutes off for a tea break, and I couldn't find a seat, not one. All of them blacks had it. Blacks, Greeks, Poles, the lot of them. All of them aliens had it. Sorry for a bit of acting there, I couldn't help it. Aston's seemingly altruistic and certainly local act in bringing Davis home is actually underpinned by Aston's own dispirited sense of the world. It's an act of care for the down-and-out Davies, and yet a wish to address his own pointlessness and failing mental health. The down-and-out Davies, however, then finds himself quite in the middle of 2 brothers, Mick and Aston, and is aware that his only currency is in his offer to look after the house, but switches his loyalty betwixt the brothers as he tries to back a winner, as it were, and with it the prospect of staying on as a caretaker. He has little prospect of earning until, he says, he manages a journey to Sidcup to get his papers. But to journey to Sidcup, he needs a pair of shoes. Whilst Ayn Rand propagates our sympathy for wealthy industrialists that are undone by the dishonest and political machinations of looters, Pinter reveals the terrible need of a non-person to gain an approval that is the crux of his being able to stay under a roof and belong at least to something. Without license, he's the object of cruelty. They bat him back and forth as a weapon of their own disagreement. In Atlas Shrugged, Rant describes Dagny Taggart peering into the dwelling of a family and seeing that the cooker has long since fallen into disrepair and is now being used as a makeshift wardrobe crammed with ragged clothes. In The Caretaker, Pinter describes a room in which stands similarly a disused stove, on top of which, though, sits an incongruous statue of a Buddha. For Rant, the broken stove is a result of an economy broken by the falsity of legislated equality, whilst for Pinter, the addition of a Buddha sitting on the useless stove hints at the loss of true social compassion in a failing welfare state. The Buddha presides over the suffering of Davies and Ashton, and it's smashed in the wake of Davies' clear mistake in revealing his own capacity for dog-eat-dog behaviour, as opposed to his kindness. It is this loss of what Adam Smith described as loveliness that clearly loses him his chance to stay. It's interesting that for Pinter, the notion of staying is the point, whilst Ayn Rand considers the decision of the inhabitants to stay in a ghost town following the collapse of the factory a nihilistic state, a pointlessness. The industrialists, in her view, the true social builders, all leave as well. True loveliness, as Adam Smith would have it, is nowhere to be seen in Atlas Shrugged, and the characters tend to be painted as a simplistic binary. The good and industrious are handsome, the bad are parasitical, incompetent, corrupt, and ugly. That her protagonists can dedicate themselves so completely and purely to work is also perhaps because they don't have children. Smith, on the other hand, examines the human instinct for helping one another, beyond family, actually, and for behaving altruistically, constructing this on an argument that has its basis in survival of numbers, but that is localized. We pick one another up because we're in something together. Christopher Boehm, director of the Jane Goodall Research Center and professor of anthropology and biological sciences at the University of Southern California, studies the early tribes of the Pleistocene age. Not the Plasticine age, as Felix put it the other day, which I told him was in the 1970s. In his recent book, Moral Origins, The Evolution of Virtue, Altruism and Shame, argues too that morality is an original human imperative. He observes that there are two ways of trying to create a good life, quote. One is by punishing evil, and the other is by actively promoting virtue, close quote. In part 3 of the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith refers with frightening current resonance to a supposed earthquake in China. He describes our initial expression of sorrow for the suffering of fellow human beings, but a rather swift return to our own concerns, frivolities, and diversions. One hopes that in a truly global age of communication, we can affect this positively, but of course he's right. Our projected compassion is insufficient in scale to the unimaginable difficulties of the Nepalese at this very moment. And hopefully we do what we can to help. Adam Smith's book begins with a definition of compassion, a response born out of empathy with the sufferer. This empathy for Smith is not wholly positive, since to an extent it's made up of the fear of physical harm. When we see suffering, we envision a physical analogy of it in our own body. Smith does not entirely account for the difference between sympathy and empathy that I find myself so often reiterating in the teaching space when considering theatre and critical analysis. Sympathy is essentially political in nature, cognitive and rational, whilst empathy, of course, is more instinctive and of the heart. In both these contexts, though, we're using a kind of inner arithmetic of standing ourselves in the place of others, imagining what if it were I, imagining pain, and applying this projection to a decision concerning the conscience of our actions. And this is far from perfect, of course. I'll discuss shortly my adaptation for stage of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Flight to Arras. But in truth, this point of Smith's about an inner arithmetic is actually no better illustrated than by an earlier literary flight to Arras, a different one. And that can be found in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. The book is characterized by self-sacrifice and suffering. But in his chapter entitled A Tempest in the Brain, Hugo describes the exquisite moral torture that follows the discovery that an innocent man called Champmathieu lies in a prison of Arras because he has been misidentified as the fugitive Jean Valjean. Valjean himself, now a successful industrialist and mayor, spends a night of turmoil. You've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. Recognizing that whilst he could live a future without being hunted, with the condemnation of this man, he could not live with himself. Hugo describes the irresistible process of his conscience. Valjean travels to Arras in the morning to hand himself in as, quote, a man in a devilish hurry, close quote. In the musical, this moral torment is contained by the song, Who Am I? In his discussion of Smith's theory of moral sentiments, Russ Roberts also uses the song to illustrate Smith's idea that we deploy an imagined impartial spectator to view ourselves as others might, a sort of observer of our own action. And when we consider this idea of who I am, theatrically, we realize just what a useful vehicle of research performance is in its various iterations of self and other. In his book, The Rainbow of Desire, Brazilian theatre practitioner Augusto Boal referred to the three I's of the performer. I, myself, I as character, and I as audience. That is to say that whilst I stand here now, I sort of sit over there and judge myself from a distance. And its worst form, that's stage fright, which I haven't got yet, so we're all right. Smith refers to the use of this observer then of self as being a meter for our wish for approbation or approval, a personal critical commentator. He describes this quality of behaviour on our part as forming his loveliness. But we need to take care not to view the word purely with the lightness that a contemporary reading might suggest. Loveliness refers to the choice for right action, not born of the need to please, so much as a wish to serve with for Smith, prudence, justice, and beneficence. I'll translate that then to 1, care for oneself, 2, care for fairness to oneself and others, and 3, generosity to others. And I think it's really important to emphasize this point of Smith's, that the wish to please is not quite the same thing as the wish to serve. And actually, from the point of view of moral sentiment, the wish to please can undo that completely, of course. Depends on what you're pleasing. I like very much the view of an audience as complicit in this too. That's not to say that I think an audience is to blame. But an audience is rather not inactive either. The audience, whilst silent, is participating in the testing of moral boundaries. They place themselves in the shoes of the protagonist, consider their own position and actions, sympathise and cathartically empathise. So as I sit, perhaps in theatre, as witness, how could I not be complicit? And how could I not be aware of my own position? This sometimes forms a binary discomfort born out of finding beauty in the terrible, giving rise to questions about one's moral ground. It also shores up the imperative for moral behaviour whilst illustrating that this is complex and political in reality. There are lots of examples of that sort of binary terror in theatre, but I think probably the clearest one for everyone is a film such as Schindler's List, because if we think about Schindler's List, we would never refer to it as a film that we like, because there's a difference between liking and appreciating, but we certainly appreciate it. And in the same way, it was very deliberately filmed for beauty. You see terrible, terrible scenes in the film with beautiful cinematography. So what that actively does in an audience is generate a sense of guilt, for the simple reason that we actively recognize that we are finding something beautiful and terrible at the same time. And this is referred by, I think probably originally by Rebecca Schneider in The Explicit Body and Performance, as binary terror. Sorry, sidetrack. I might easily apply those qualities to the actions then, quite relevantly, and dignity of Janusz Korczak. Korczak had been a medical doctor in a Warsaw children's hospital prior to founding an orphanage for Jewish children in 1911. When the Nazis moved the orphans to the ghetto, he refused to leave them, even though he was offered his freedom. In 1940, in the Warsaw ghetto, he staged with the children Rabindranath Tagore's play, The Post Office. Rabindranath Tagore himself is really most valuable to us. He's very present here. This Nobel laureate poet and Bengali educationalist was the inspiration for the Dartington College model of liberal arts that underpins so much of our curricular philosophy here, but most certainly at the Creative Campus. And there's a beautiful portrait of him in Millap Fest's offices there. The Post Office, though, his play, concerns a dying boy, confined by the doctor to his room and looking out upon a world with aspirational wonder. He's visited daily by a variety of characters, the milkman, postman, children, and can see the building of the King's new post office yonder. He gives his toys away to the children and wishes for a letter from the King. Eventually, the King's own physician arrives, penultimately actually, to announce that the King will visit in the night, amazing everyone. The boy says that he'll ask the King to make him a postman when he's well, so that he might wander far and wide. But then he passes quietly away. The beauty of Tagore's text is that somehow in the magnanimity of this poorly little boy who has an instinct of reverence and, quote, a good heart, Tagore's text assures us that his death is a release to a wonderful adventure and to his freedom. In 1942, 2 years after staging The Post Office, Korczak's orphans were moved for extermination to Treblinka, and he again refused to leave them, even though he was offered his freedom. Robert Shapiro quotes an eyewitness account by one Joshua Pearl describing Korczak leaving the ghetto to die with the children. Quote, marching, his head bent forward, holding the hand of a child. A few nurses were followed by 200 children, dressed in clean and meticulously cared-for clothes. Close quote. It's a powerful image that deserves expression in art. Theatre provides us not only with allegory, but also a vehicle for witness and testimony. The most basic function of theatre has to be its capacity for questioning morality. And there's certainly nothing new in suggesting that all serious theatre deals in contexts of conflict. But drawing on the Aristotelian notion of catharsis, we can begin to construct a view, using Adam Smith's thesis, that theatre also has the capacity to localise the distant, to draw us closer. We are made familiar with characters and their circumstance, with plight and tragedy. We are transported to other places, other times, and we are complicit. Of course, there are examples in the past of that being used very negatively as well. Sorry, one moment. I suppose one example, while I've just sort of paused for a second, might be Hitler's use of Enttarteterkunst and some of the films he made to dissuade people from compassion rather than to create it. As an audience, we're mutual, and whilst our interpretation or response may differ, there's a general consensus, an invisible conversation that checks the boundaries of morality. Who or what is right? What should or should we not do? What do we reject? Theatre also suspends social taboo. Here we're usually able, with some exception, to discuss openly viscerality, sexuality, crime, hatred, and injustice. In the mainstream theatre space, we might see nudity or have exposed the deepest hypocrisy. Again, Antonin Artaud was acutely aware of this and recognised therein the possibility that theatre was the only space, other than at the time of plague, when we could view human morality and action as it truly exists, quite apart from rank and role. And of course, we might think of that in terms of the disasters that we come across as well. Rank and role, to a certain extent, disappears, and human beings are human beings. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, whilst constantly reminded of his rank and role, disagreed with the pressure of government and his publisher to write and not to fight. In Flight to Arras, published in 1942, he describes the futility of his sorties during the invasion of France. the disconnection of the general staff from the reality and needs of squadrons, and the unravelling disaster of a tide of evacuating refugees, ravishing village upon village of food and heading towards nothing. But in the midst of the ruination of his country and culture, Saint-Exupéry searches for a light in the darkness, for a future. And it was a joy to perform this. He arrives at a recognition that hope is actually not found in the fact that someone survives, or even in our agreed outrage at the fact of an event or rejection of its perpetrators, but rather in the fact that people hold one another, share food, give up their space on a lorry, pull others from the dust and the rubble. It's a beautiful realization that leads him to a final outpouring of philosophy and a refinding of God that is urgent and heartfelt. We celebrate the work and bravery of services at times of devastation, but I'm referring more to those that simply do it out of an immediate humanity. Saint-Exupéry writes, "I believe that what my civilization calls charity is the sacrifice granted mankind for the purpose of his own fulfillment. Charity is the gift made to mankind, present in the insignificance of the individual. Charity creates mankind." Close quote. We're also driven, according to Smith, to need the sympathy of others with our own grief and joy. We want our problems commiserated and our levity laughed at. Commiseration feels just in the wake of the unjust, whilst mirth confirms fellowship. And we're all aware of attempting a balance of these qualities in the projection of ourselves to others. On the other hand, we are pleased to sympathise with the afflictions of others, but less willing to celebrate their joys if we feel that, as Smith puts it, they are too much elevated with any little piece of good fortune. Mutual accord is also, therefore, a key context for the capacity to assist others. In Adam Smith's words, "I judge of your sight by my sight, of your ear by my ear, of your reason by my reason, of your resentment by my resentment, of your love by my love. I neither have nor can have any other way of judging about them." Close quote. Moreover, our expectation of sympathy is actively strategized. Smith observes an inherent ability to lower the pitch of our passion, and by passion he means our anguish, to that which matches the capacity of our audience to place them in the shoes of our suffering. In this way, Smith argues that an audience has an immediate effect to return us somewhat towards tranquility, because they reduce the fact of our first-hand experience to the scale of their ability to sympathise with it. They make us feel a little better. This equanimity is characterised by Smith by quoting Mark 12:31, "You shall love your neighbour as yourself," which is from the King James Bible. The nature of his sympathy, Adam Smith argues, has more to do with an appreciation of circumstance and scenario than of imagined physical pain, since pain, once removed, is forgotten fast. Now, Smith refers to the Greek theatre of Sophocles, saying that it's not the pain of Philoctetes, who is agonized for a decade by a snake bite to the foot, but the injustice of his sole exile to an island during that time that affects us. Having said so, the fact of his agony defines him. And it's interesting that Smith chooses a play in which the moral discussion of the good of the individual versus the good of the many is actually paramount. In Flight to Arras, Saint-Exupéry describes a similar circumstance of the Spanish Civil War, wherein a man pulled from under the rubble of a house describes his concern for a pocket watch that was a wedding gift. He couldn't reach it because his arms were pinned behind him. And it's not his pain that's recalled, but his broken duty of care, his pride, and he's thrilled when he discovers that it still works. I've always loved the objectivity of Saint-Exupéry's subjectivity. I'm pleased with that line, by the way, because it sounds like a complete contradiction in terms. But that is to say that his inclination towards a philosophy of human experience is dependent upon distance, as a pilot far above the earth, and his observations are terribly beautiful. My interest in Saint-Exupéry, originating in my childhood with his book The Little Prince, which I'm sure many of us have read, was resurgent as I searched to understand the death of my own grandfather on my father's side, a refugee Polish-Ukrainian pilot whose Wellington bomber crashed into a mountain in December 1944, the same year as Saint-Exupéry's death. I began to consider too my grandfather's escape in 1939 on foot across Europe, escaping from a concentration camp in Romania and finally arriving in Britain to be retrained in Blackpool with the RAF. When people flee, it's often actually across mountains and at night. For some years then, I made work, therefore, that transported audiences by night over ranges. I'm particularly pleased to see Professor Peter Harrop here tonight, because he was very patient whilst I was making some of that work some years ago whilst at Chester. There's something in the peril of such real journeys, mirrored at least by the risk of an audience experience at night, that felt like an imperative of performance to me. The work inspired me to travel in the Himalaya around Ladakh, where, despite preparation, I fell ill with altitude sickness after an ascent to a monastery by four-wheel drive. I mention this because after being brought down by around 1,000 meters, I was cared for a week by a family living in absolute poverty, and they broke their bread with me, washed my clothes, sat with me. I played cricket very badly with their children, which they were disgusted by. And you might understand how the themes of my talk feel inextricable. I intend to research the performance of the pilgrimage in the coming period, considering, for example, the Stations of the Cross, which is performed every year at Easter, but also the Islamic Hajj. And I hope actually to make my own walk around Mount Kailash, the center of the Buddhist universe, the home of Shiva in the Hindu religion, and the place of enlightenment for the Jain teacher Adinata. The liminality of movement. Here's a slide. The liminality of movement of the journey has long been associated with philosophical exploration, and this is no more true than in religious texts that present the notion of becoming in respect of arduous travel. The lives of Christ, Muhammad, and Buddha all involved the journey as a crucial vehicle to revelation, dissemination, and conflict. In his book Walkscapes, Francisco Carreri also considers the murder of Abel by Cain in the book of Genesis to be the allegory of our distrust of nomadism compared to stasis, of philosophy compared to fact. Cain is, of course, condemned to wander the earth. Religious biographies are not alone in emphasizing the relevance of narratives of travel. Norse saga is typified by the journey as ordeal, and the hardship of lives and travel features in many cultural systems, such as the classical Greek, with both positive and negative outcomes, particularly involving the fall of man. The primary vehicle in the realization of Oedipus' prophesied plight is certainly founded in the journey, beginning with his parents' removal of him to the wilderness to die. He's subsequently saved by a shepherd and brought up in another region. He returns to Thebes to escape the very prophecy that he travels toward and brutally kills his own father, King Laius, on the road, fulfilling part of that prophecy. Examples of this fatedness are numerous. All of Jason's journeys with the Argonauts lead to his eventual destitution without Medea, as he dies under the collapsed and rotting bulk of his ship, the Argo. Homer's Odyssey describes the 10-year journey home of Odysseus, cursed by Poseidon, storm-ravaged, attacked, bewitched, drawn by the sirens and lotus-eaters, punished by Zeus. Who wouldn't want to see theatre like that? In classical philology, W.B. Stanford considered interpretations of meaning for the name Odysseus, for the etymology of the name, where the name came from. And these range from incurring wrath to hated man. But whichever way we read it, Odysseus' name meant trouble. So travel has long been associated with taking risk then, and the origin of the word experience is etymologically contained in the original word per, which synonymously meant to take risk or cross a space. Carreri illustrates this with words such as peril. This can also be found in experiment, for example. And as such, the notion of crossing unknown space is woven with that of the efficacy of taking a risk. Inherent in the term is action, something done while something is risked, and so we might arrive again at the idea of something performed. It makes me think of dance. So now I sidestep. Fully aware of her own physical state before she died, you can actually see my great aunt. Well, you can't actually, but just at the bottom there. Fully aware of her own physical state before she died, the last thing that my great aunt Veronica asked me in Ukraine, with the fragile chuckle of 90 years, was whether I would like to tango. As a young student at the university in Lviv, she'd loved to dance. Her question was a joke, of course, and very typical of her humour to her last breath. But it had resonance for me, not least because of the survival of this woman who had been put to slave labour by a Gestapo gun to her head in the marketplace, who had worked in a Soviet power plant for 40 years. I once had the pleasure of learning some basic Argentine tango, which I'm sure I've forgotten, from an elderly American lady in Minnesota that had danced it with her husband every day for 40 years. Watching an Argentine company dance it, I was struck by the depictions of conflict and tragedy that were always adjacent to passion and love. It's a dance of difference, and not always of agreement, being a live discussion of control, of a permission to lead, only granted by consent that is often deferred through kicks of the legs. And in actual fact, tango comes originally from immigrants. Sally Potter explores this in her 1997 film, The Tango Lesson, narrating the complex exchanges of control in a relationship to an Argentine dancer, Pablo Theron, whom she gives a film role to as an exchange for lessons in tango. And as they lead each other in each respective context, the resulting and ultimately intimately emotional conflict threatens their relationship and their dance. In the tango is the gesture of danger, threat, and that risk involved in performance, in peril, in the crossing of space. In the tango, though, is the assertion that in the midst of this peril, there might be something crucial to be shared and gained from the other, but we need to negotiate a space together, appraise one another, and define our difference in conference. Now, in this sense, there's a natural link to terms that confer a state of knowledge, such as well-travelled. If we've travelled, then we've encountered risk, out of which there is the reward of a more meaningful, empirical understanding of ourselves, resulting in wiseness. Travel certainly forms character and attitude. It also forms exhaustion. At 9:30 p.m, that moment when work has hopefully ceased, the children are to bed, and sapped energy allows for a last hour on a sofa, I turn my attention briefly to screen drama. I must admit that my wife and I had reached season 3 of The Walking Dead at the point of beginning to write this. Now, on the one hand, we might view the series as a zombie horror and nothing more, and yet what it does with intricacy is to hold somewhat of a microscope over social disintegration in the wake of apocalypse. It sort of takes me back to Ayn Rand. What's admirable in the seasons of Walking Dead is the imperceptibility of the shift in social attitude, the loss of hope and of care for the living beyond the tight circle of the group. This latter phenomenon is particular as a theme to season 3, reaching a culminating return to a duty of care. The beginning of episode 12 depicted the most astonishing indication that humanity was doomed to extinction. Group leader Rick Grimes and his 12-year-old son Carl are out in a car, seeking formula milk for the baby sister. On the ruined road in a forested area, they drive slowly past a lone man with a backpack and pots and pans. He waves desperately, begging them loudly to stop. They slow and drive past, expressionless, but taking him in as a curiosity. In silence, they accelerate away, and he runs pointlessly after them, shouting and waving until they disappear. Nothing is said. At the end of the episode, as they return, we see the half-eaten corpse of this man beside the road. They pull up, retrieve his backpack, and leave. As a moment of drama without dialogue, this is the antithesis of the Good Samaritan, and I'm reminded without subtlety of the absence of Adam Smith's notion of loveliness. We realise that the complete loss of compassion and its replacement with at best suspicion, at worst indifference, spells the end of humanity. The group can only fail if they don't grow. They will only decline. And if they're unable to access a notion of trust, there's no future. Episode by episode, there's a loss of expression in the performance of the son Carl Grimes. Not poor performance, but rather a very subtle adjustment as he enters adolescence to a dog-eat-dog mentality. He takes up wearing his father's sheriff Stetson, just as we realise the emerging damage and perversion of his own sense of moral justice. Any future seems impossible. Here is Conrad's heart of darkness laid savagely bare, and we know with certainty that the future is dark. One's drawn to wonder who are the walking dead of the title. We're shown again and again that the characters are merely dead men walking, but the tragedy becomes deeper as their own realization of this fact becomes clear in acts of selfish abandonment, murder, and distrust. The only repeated altruism is a shot through the head for those that get bitten and infected, the granting of a clean, quick death. But the beginning of season 4 swings back from that precipice. Since the group has allowed others to join, and the son has discarded the Sheriff Stetson, saying that it's the wrong hat for gardening. He's regaining his moral compass, believing that something might grow just as they plant their first crops. That all gets ruined, though, by the emergence of a Liverpudlian. the actor David Morrissey, who I'm very pleased to sort of blag, actually, is a sort of cousin of my stepfather's, and we have the Morrises here tonight, so not David, but I'm very pleased with that. David Morrissey plays a character called the Governor, who meets with Rick Grimes to find a truce between their groups and to try and live in adjacent peace. But none of them take the possibility seriously, and they just completely distrust the other. Inevitably, when the Governor returns in season 4, this leads to the death of dozens of people, and the Governor's brutal execution of the most moral man, Herschel Green. As a doctor in the series, Herschel had previously risked his life for everyone, remarking, quote, "I can save lives, and that's enough reason to risk mine," close quote. Enough of my spoilers. What's fascinating in the complexity of The Walking Dead, I think, is the examination of the loss of what Adam Smith regarded as loveliness. Yet there's also a confirmation of the locality of compassion that he suggests, because the group repeatedly struggles to assimilate others within its own borders. They are met with deep distrust and a brutal recognition of the far greater danger posed by the living than the dead. The paradox is, of course, that the living will only live if they can transcend this and join with others along the way. Perilous encounter after encounter leads to hair-trigger decisions, sometimes wherein the trigger is pulled, others where the transition is achieved and the group numbers grow, but always involving travel. And this is relative. Members are often bitten by walkers, the name given to zombies. We realise hope, though, because whilst there's a clear restriction of Adam Smith's altruism to the boundary of the group, there's still a will to draw others within these boundaries of belonging, if they prove themselves. Robert's view of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments is that it's overwhelmingly a book about the people closest to us, the ones that we can actively sympathise with. He is aware, of course, that Smith wrote in an age when global immediacy of contact was unimaginable. Having said this, he points out that our feeling that we alone cannot change the world is false. Smith says it's false. And like the drops that make up the ocean, our immediate and individual behaviour has a resonance that spreads far beyond our realisation of its impact. We can indeed change the world. We hopefully aspire to this in education, as educationists, of course. But neither should we forget that a redefinition and realisation of locality might very well extend the geography of human altruistic instinct. This is all a question of our consideration of common spaces of belonging, that we form new common spaces of belonging, rather than arguments of difference, which is one of the reasons I so very much enjoy the experience of scout leading for children. And I'm very proud to have some of my fellow scouts and leaders here tonight. Baden-Powell's original intention for scouting ran across the divide of class and culture to consider the true value of community service, moral sentiment, and redefinitions of belonging. I think because of the uniform, he was originally sort of accused of a sort of military intent, but he absolutely denied that. And history proved him right as well in many respects. That wasn't his view of scouting. It wasn't what he wanted. He also adored the arts. He was very interested in drama and theatre. And in a way, because of that, we have the tradition in scouting of the gang show, which goes back nearly 80 years now. And the gang shows are huge regional shows. And many of our students that come here because of the gang show. There's one over there that's about to join us in September. I'd probably say the gang show's probably had an influence on your decision to study performing arts. Not to embarrass you, Josh. So the arts, from the outset, he was interested for his programme of betterment. And I wasn't surprised to discover the 57th Rabindranath Tagore group in India. Since in setting up the first meeting of international scouting, Baden-Powell had quoted Tagore in his speech. And this is what he said: "It is through brotherhood and not through organisation that the world should be ordered. We are all citizens in the kingdom of ideas. There will be those large enough to see the human race as a whole who understand that the good of the community as a family exists." I felt this community of belonging with an absolute immediacy, both in my Global Hope experience with the Ramakrishna mission in Brazil last year, and also as I spent a day with the scouts out there. The Ramakrishna mission is just incredible. I've never seen such altruism for poor children. It just moved us on a daily basis. And our students worked with 1,000 children during that period of time, ranging from about 6 all the way up to 18. It really is an incredible project, and I was very proud to have a role in it. Theatre naturally brings us into that shared space as participants in discussion and declaration of Smith's moral sentiments. But the university also intends a strategic vision for these qualities with its Service and Leadership Award for undergraduates, with its sending of them to work with the children of underprivileged communities in Global Hope projects around the world, with its investment in such things as the Cornerstone Festival and our new playwriting competition. Hayley, you went to Uganda as well, didn't you, with Global Hope, as I remember last year. The university sector, particularly in light of last week's election, needs to protect its imperative to develop leadership and social and political morality. This is not incommensurate with industry, as Rant would have it, but rather concordant with it, as Smith says. Universities should be driven by philosophical betterment and social justice that is not disfigured by a growing financial objectivity. Graduates must learn that the virtue of altruism and that of self-betterment are two sides of the same coin. Thank you.
Vice-Chancellor, Pro-Chancellor, distinguished guests and colleagues, as Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, it gives me great pleasure tonight to thank Professor Simon Piasecki for his wonderful and intellectually challenging inaugural lecture. In his lecture on the wealth of moral sentiments, altruism, peril and performance, he's engaged us in a journey which helps us to understand the importance of performance and how it allows us as human beings to have empathy with others, often exploring difficult topics, usually in safe spaces. I think the title of tonight's lecture again gives us a sense of Professor Piasecki's work and his direction. And it certainly links very appropriately with the context of the university's mission and values, where we have strong commitments to educating students in mind, body and spirit. Indeed, education should be both a journey of discovery and life-changing. I think we would all agree on that. In his talk, he's taken us on an exploratory journey, I think, in which he's uncovered and explained the sources of his inspiration as a performer, teacher, writer, and researcher. As we've seen, he is engaged with a fascinating array of writers, thinkers, and playwrights, beginning with the work of Adam Smith, going all the way through to Pinter, and even to the contemporary with The Walking Dead. In looking at Adam Smith's work, he's drawn inspiration from an early study on the theory of moral sentiment, which was published long before The Wealth of Nations, and a less well-known work. In this earlier work, Smith does refer to a human capacity for loveliness, a right-mindedness which is captured in some of the comments that Simon's articulated to us tonight. As Simon quotes, loveliness refers to the choice for right action, not born of the need to please so much as a wish to serve, with for Smith, prudence, justice and beneficence. In some way, again, Simon translates this for us and makes it amenable to today. It's care for oneself, care for fairness to oneself and others, and generosity to others. These themes resonate throughout his approach and in our teaching, I think, and research and outreach at Hope. Again, in his lecture tonight, what he's made us aware of is that there is an alternative and a less palatable side to human nature. And he does contrast for us very nicely, I think, Smith's work with that more recent novel by Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, which actually depicts really a dystopian America, where the author explores through her characters the degradation and collapse of society. In this novel, it's argued that antagonists lack virtue. There's no intention to moral goodness. Rand's work typifies her own philosophical and possibly conservative position, with a focus on ethical egoism and her advocacy of rational selfishness. So the book explores the advocacy of reason, individualism, capitalism, and the failures of governmental coercion. Indeed, a theme that's perhaps appropriate in recent times here. In drawing this sharp distinction, Professor Piasecki highlights for us the risks that societies face, including collapse and degradation. I think in drawing on Smith's work, he aims to highlight for us the human instinct to help one another beyond the family and for behaving in an altruistic manner. He notes, however, that Smith himself, given the time he was writing in, thought that such behavior was quite localized and territorial, whereby humans were more likely to support each other in the context of mutual belonging. Smith's work was in some ways underpinned by an understanding then of empathy, which is seen as compassion and a response to others. He questions again, Professor Piasecki here, whether Smith sufficiently distinguishes between sympathy and empathy. In reflecting on this, he draws his own distinction. He sees sympathy as a political in nature, cognitive and rational, whilst empathy is more instinctive and of the heart. This is clearly linked to how we understand others, such as in a performance space, where we imagine the what if, as he says, the place I'm in, how I see that. It makes us consciously think about others, which of course is what playwrights and performers intend of us. Indeed, he suggests again that when we consider the idea of who I am theatrically, we realize just what a useful vehicle of research performance is in its various iterations of self and other. So that very much connects us with our contemporary and the problems that we face in society today. In his lecture, I think he's explored again the opposites and ideas, Tagore's The Post Office, Shapiro's examination of Jan Korczak's The Jewish Orphans. He's given us some sense again. The key point is that theatre provides not only a means to question morality, but also acts as a vehicle to bring us closer to distant events. If anything, this challenges Smith's thesis around localization, and certainly in a contemporary globalized world, it suggests as humans we have the capacity to empathize with others and with events far removed from our daily lives. I think not just Nepal, but Syria today, Yemen come to mind. The underlying theme throughout much of this lecture has been that human capacity to do good triumphs over our capacity to do evil. This he exemplifies in his discussion of Saint-Subre's novel Flight to Arras, which again he performed here during his adaptation of it, performed at the Cornerstone Arts Festival last November. That was a wonderful play, and the performance I think everyone enjoyed much. And I think, again, it caused us to reflect and understand in a way not only the horrors of war and its destruction, whilst at the same time marveling at the capacity of humans to help others at moments of absolute despair. And again, I think we see that in some of Simon's work, and I think that typifies him as a performer. In explaining to us tonight how performance helps us to understand human behaviour, he aims to highlight the importance of understanding the journey, or as he said to us, the travel, on which we embark in order to attain a deeper understanding of our nature as human beings. That travel is associated with risk, and as he's pointed out to us, meaning to cross a space, is a risky business. And in essence, that gives us an insight to performance and the importance of performing art spaces and how we use them. It allows us to explore those difficult and sometimes risky subjects that societies face. In the latter part of his lecture, he's reflected on The Walking Dead, and I suspect those of us who watch bits of that series, or maybe all of it, depending on our time, will understand when he talks about the risks there, the loss of compassion, the risk of suspicion and indifference, which may spell the end of the human race. And indeed, as he's cited to us tonight, the loss of loveliness, an interesting concept. So again, there is that possibility of redemption even in The Walking Dead, and that hope survives, but it depends on individuals. So I suppose in some ways Professor Piasecki concludes that we can indeed change the world, and he suggests we need to get beyond the local to think about the common spaces of belonging rather than the differences, which challenges Smith's original emphasis on belonging as being localized or tribal. I think here again of the Mediterranean today and those who are fleeing often difficult circumstances, traveling to far places, and risking lives. I think also for me as an international relations scholar, I suppose I always think we should move between the local and the global, whereby morality and altruism need to be emphasized over self-interest and immoral behaviors, and should be reflected in our commitments to global social justice. As a university, we are committed to exploring the themes of morality, ethics, and social justice through our teaching and research. And I'm assured tonight that Professor Piasecki in his work makes a significant contribution to, through his teaching and research, to the university's mission and values. We're also very proud of the Department of Drama, Dance and Performance and the work it engages in. We see the department achieving great things under his leadership, guidance and direction. And certainly those of us who worked closely with Simon over the last couple of years will be aware very much of his many qualities, and indeed his understanding and sensitivity to colleagues and students whom he treats with the utmost respect and inclusivity. As I come to a close, I'd like to thank Professor Piasecki for his continuing contribution to hope, and we look forward to great things in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Professor Rees, for that very fine summary of what has been an absorbing lecture. I wondered from the title, Simon, where you were going, and I understand perfectly now how the two books of Adam Smith were brought together. We do forget, of course, that Adam Smith was not primarily an economist, but a moral philosopher. And I hope this great Scot is not forgotten, especially in the time we all live in, post these last elections. We forget that the title, Wealth of Nations, came from the language of the Book of Common Prayer, and that before he explored this theme, he pondered, like you did this evening, deeply about the moral sentiments. It's interesting, which is an indictment on the kind of commodification of our education that goes on, that you dare to speak about the wealth of moral sentiments and not just the wealth of nations. I'm particularly pleased that heads of departments at this university take these big issues seriously. And therefore I add to the Dean's words in saying how delighted we are that you tackled it tonight. Of course, as Dean said, we are very, very proud of this department with great potential to do 10 times as much as it's done in the last few years under Simon's leadership. And so, Simon, if you would come forward and accept a little gift that we normally give our new professors. There was a guest that I was reminded not to forget, who's come up from London for this meeting. She's the curator of modern and contemporary performance at the Victoria and Albert Museum, Dr. Kate Dorney, who's also part of a validation process here. Where is she? You're very welcome, Kate. Nice to have you with us. Thank you very much, everybody, and good evening.